Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar Wednesdays. So my name is Corey Scienza. I'm a senior data privacy and security analyst here at CyberData Pros, and I would love to spend some time with everybody here today and sort of give out a overview or an introduction to the ISO 27701 standard. This is going to include a review of the 27001 standard, which perhaps maybe you're going to be a little more familiar with, but since 27701 is based on 27001 as an addition, we will be reviewing that. We're going to go over all the key elements of 27001, what it's designed to do, how it's designed to do it, what it's designed to protect, as well as some of the controls and steps that your business can take in order to implement 27701. So we're going to take just a minute, wait for others to join. If you have any questions in the chat or would like to introduce yourself, I'd love to see those as well. I see we have Kylie here on my team. She's always excited for these webinars. I know she loves to be a part of these. She tends to says she tends to learn a lot from them, so I appreciate that from her. Like I said, taking just a minute, waiting for others to join. At 12:05, we will go ahead and get started. And we will have time at the end for questions. If you do have questions at any point throughout the webinar, please feel free to hit them or send them in the chat. Be happy to answer them. But we will have time for questions at the end as well if there is any. Also, this event is being recorded, so I did mention as well. So the event is being recorded, so this will be available to download and watch at a later date as well. So if I happen to gloss over something that you're perhaps a little more interested in, you'll be able to go and review everything that we went over with a little more detail. All right, I think we're all set and we're going to go ahead and get started. So one more time for anybody who's just joined us, my name is Corey Scienza, Senior Data Privacy and Security Analyst here at CyberData Pros. We're going to be giving an introduction to 27701 Privacy Edition to the ISO 27001 standard. So we're going to be doing an overview of 27001, how it works, then introducing 27701, which is in and of itself an addition or an add-on to the 27001 standard. We'll be defining what it is, what it designs to protect, how it's designed to do that, some tips and tricks, as well as some of the key components of that standard. So let's go ahead and get into it. So starting off with our review, we need to look at the standard of ISO 27001, which is what 27701 itself is based as an addition upon to. So ISO 27001 is obviously part of the International Standards Organization that sets out criteria for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and the continual improvement of information security over an organization. It does this through something called the ISMS. which in a nutshell is a privacy or a policy documentation that is designed to document a systematic approach to managing sensitive information from your company and ensuring its confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And we'll mention that here in a moment as well. So this standard is designed to follow those three principles that I just mentioned. And if anybody in the cybersecurity or information security industry is familiar with anything, it is that confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So we in the business call this the CIA triad. It is the pillar of information security systems and is really the root of cybersecurity and information security when you really continue to boil it down. So there are a number of key elements within 27001 that would easily take the entire webinar to review in and of itself. So rather than go down the rabbit hole and go into all those little details, I'm going to go over some of the major highlights for the sake of our time, since 27701 is what we're all really here for. So part of 27001, or in my opinion, the most important part of the 27001 standard is scoping. And that scoping applies to the ISMS and the certification itself. So regardless of your organization's size, industry, or what sector, what type of business it's in, scope is the context and organizationally specific meaning behind achieving or attempting to achieve that standard, so you can ensure the only relevant controls are being tested against. That way, there's no undue burden on you, your employees, or your organization to be able to approve or implement controls over systems that aren't necessary to your organization. So some of the objectives, for example, for 27001, as we mentioned before, is that confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information within your organization. So there are a number of ways 27001 accomplishes these objectives. And I'm going to go over those now. And this sort of gives an overview of really what the standard's about. So these include things like risk assessment and management. So the 27001 standard puts a huge emphasis and importance on identifying and assessing information security risks, as well as implementing controls to mitigate and manage them effectively. Now, obviously, not all risk can be mitigated, so that's why we do mention manage as well. There are quite a number of inherent risks just to doing business that can't be completely removed. And it's the real world. We need to understand this. So there are going to be some risks that we simply need to accept, and the risk assessment and risk management process allows us to identify all these risks, categorize these risks, and making sure we're managing those properly, and there isn't undue risk to your organization on a continual basis. We do this through continual monitoring and assessments, and these can include conducting things like internal audits and risk assessments. All of these assessments and their findings are tracked to what we call a risk register, which is something that is reviewed at least on a quarterly basis and is used to monitor risks across the entire organization. Another huge element of the 27001 standard is what we call the PDCA cycle. Essentially, this is a standard, stands for plan, do, check, and act, which sort of defines how we go about taking action on some of these risks or some vulnerabilities, or continuously proving based on the standards we set in the ISMS. So that's a really important sort of pillar that this standard revolves around. Documentation is another one that is massive to these data privacy and compliance frameworks. 27001 is no exception. So for 27001, it does require development and maintenance of quite a number of different documents and policies, the ISMS, of course, being chief among them. There's still a number of others that include your information security risk policy, risk assessments and reports, as well as procedures for implementing security controls and procedures for day-to-day activities, or even hopefully less day-to-day activities such as incident management and disaster recovery. So I did mention security controls there a moment ago. So security controls are, I think, the most obvious thing that people think of when they think of a regulatory standard. So this standard says I need to meet X number of objectives, whether that be antivirus to set on laptops, controlling software installations, maybe even making sure that servers have proper ventilation so they don't overheat, or battery backups in case power goes out. All these things we consider security controls. So the 27001 implements a very well-structured and comprehensive list of security controls that are organized and categorized into 14 different categories. We're not going to go over all of those today, but they do include things such as access control, encryption, incident management, and plenty more. So organizations that want to meet that 27001 compliance need to be able to implement these controls based on their needs and their specific risks to their business. So it really comes down to the context of the organization. Legal and regulatory compliance is a huge part of what 27001 is about. So this ensures that your organization is tracking and maintaining all of your legal and regulatory compliances to make sure you're not putting yourself at undue legal risk, as well as your partners and potentially even vendors. So monitoring and measurement is one of the most critical parts of the ISMS, or the Information Security Management System I mentioned earlier. So even though we have all these individual technical controls, just checking a box next to those is not what this standard is all about. It's about being able to not only check that box, but continually monitor and find objective measurements for our information security to make sure that we're always trying to identify areas of improvement. Some of the big benefits from receiving this certification are obviously protecting your own assets and information security. It's not just for that though. There is honestly, I think in our experience with a lot of our clients, one of the biggest things they look for is actually more of a reputation gain. So everybody knows your reputation in business is everything. The ISO 27001 badge on your website looks absolutely fantastic. Can even give you that competitive edge, and it makes things like vendor management and selection process so much easier, rather than having to fill out those giant questionnaires. Time after time, you just say, "Hey, we're ISO certified," and we got a green light. So there's really a lot of growth to be made using this framework and this standard. So I think for the most part, a lot of the people here looking at 27701 probably have a good grasp of 27001. So I feel that's a good enough overview to sort of define or understand what 27001 is and how it works. So now to get into part everyone's here for, we're going to start talking about 27701. So as I mentioned earlier, 27701 builds upon ISO 27001, but rather than focusing on security of information assets, 27701 is specifically tailored to add controls and monitoring and objectives surrounding privacy management. Now you might be thinking, well, of course, 27001 has privacy built into it. Doesn't it? Does and it doesn't. So there are obviously parts of 27001 where privacy is a concern, and obviously privacy is an important thing for everybody, and we want to make sure those needs are being met. But 27701 is relatively new as far as standards go, with the first revision being released in 2019. So really, 701 is focused on adding much more up-to-date, much more controlled and focused extensions to your ISMS, or PIMs, as we'll mention on a little bit later, that really focus on the specific privacy of information. And we'll go over some of the key areas it tends to do that, or it attempts to do that. So as we mentioned, it is a set of controls and extensions on top of 27001. With the pillar of 27001 being the ISMS, the 701 edition adds what we call the PIMs, or the Privacy Information Management System. So these are a set of extensions to your ISMS that we can monitor and track for privacy of your information, as well as, or not just yours, but whether you're a controller or processor. We'll go over those terms later as well, and how we measure the objectives to keeping that information secure and private. So the Privacy Information Management System is really designed to align with a lot of these international privacy regulations that are becoming more and more common. Obviously, everybody knows about GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, and this includes things like the CCPA, maybe here in the US, or the California Consumer Privacy Act. 701 is designed to try to meet those requirements in a much easier way, rather than having to track each of those individually and worry about compliance with each and every single one. So to try to go an overview of some of how 701 works, or some of the ways it actually manages this privacy, I tend to like to break it down into 7 key elements. Now, these elements are a combination of things. They're a combination of concepts, principles, and otherwise maybe individual elements or controls within the standard that I think are really good at capturing what it's all about and how we attempt to achieve these objectives. So something I mentioned a number of times already, the first being the PIMS, or the Privacy Information Management System, much like the ISMS in 27001 is the pillar of 701. So 701's approach recognizes that information security, which again, we're talking about the preservation of that CIA triad, is really the key aspect of effective privacy management. And the ISMS requirements documented in 27001 can support adding specific requirements onto the ISMS without a need for a new management system altogether. This is how the PIMS, or the Privacy Information Management System, operates. It defines extra requirements for the ISMS that specifically cover privacy, as well as the processing of PII, or personally identifiable information. Now, there are a lot of different or specific controls that relate to this data protection and privacy. And as a whole, this is what creates that Privacy Information Management System, or the PIMS. So these include things, pardon me, I've lost my place there. All right. So part of the other key elements here, now that we've established our PIMS and what it's designed to do and how it's designed to be effective, privacy principles. And this potentially goes without saying, but it's important to remember that there is more than one way to keep things private. So some of these privacy principles include things like consent management, whether that be a cookie banner on your website, or collecting email addresses for a mailing list. Purpose limitation, making sure that any data or PII that you have is only being used for the purpose it's designed for. Privacy by design is a very popular, or becoming even more popular, concept in information security, that all systems from their inception are designed to keep privacy in mind. Data minimization is a huge pillar of 27701 as well. Accuracy, storage limitations, so knowing how long your data needs to be stored there and how long it should be. The integrity, confidentiality, and availability, as we've heard before, are all privacy principles that 701 focuses on. Risk management is another large pillar of the 701 standard. So this emphasizes the importance on identifying and managing privacy-specific risks. There are a number of ways we do this. For example, DPIAs, or data protection impact assessments. Those are obviously important, and they're a huge part of the 701 standard. So obviously, organizations need to be assessing the impact of the personal data they collect, or control, or otherwise process, and make sure you have control, and make sure there are controls that are implemented to really effectively mitigate any risks that could potentially be there, of which there are always some amount of risks, whether they're inherent or not. So we also obviously need to consider legal and regulatory compliance, which is one of the reasons the 701 was developed, is to help these legal and regulatory compliance pieces be easier to manage and easier to understand. ISO does, 27001 does this in a lot of really great ways, including actually creating documentation that sets and manages all these things, that actually gets reviewed by management relatively frequently. So it keeps these things top of mind and creates a structure for understanding and actually meeting these legal requirements. Documentation, just like 27001, is critically important, if not more so, for 701. So the 701 standard outlines a lot of requirements for documenting all your policies and procedures, as well as all your personal data processing. Again, you can do this via DPIAs, as I mentioned before, or this could even include transferring of PII from one country to another. By tracking these legal and regulatory requirements, and as well as tracking where your data flows, you can ensure for you and all your partners or vendors that you're handling this data responsibly and you're meeting all local regulations wherever that data happens to be. Data subject rights is a huge part of 701 that also builds upon some of the legal and regulatory compliance we mentioned as well. So 701 does address the rights of individual data subjects, as well as data subjects as organization as well. And it does set guidelines for these organizations to make sure they're respecting and facilitating these rights of these individuals. This can come down to, again, consent management, proving that if someone is to unsubscribe from your email, that you have mechanisms in place to make sure that data subject, their rights are being upheld and they are no longer subscribed to that list. Third-party management, I think, is one of the last key areas to really understand where 27701, just really keeps privacy in mind for not just your organization, but for your partners and vendors as well. So in case of 701, organizations are required to evaluate and manage the privacy practices of their third-party service providers and anyone who handles data on their behalf. So this would be what we call a third-party processor of that data. So it is the responsibility of any 27701 certified organization to understand how all of their third parties manage their data, their partners' data, and their vendors' data to make sure that the entire pipeline stays private and secure. All right, so now that we've got sort of a general idea of how 27001 works, what it's designed to protect, and some of the mechanism it uses to protect those, I'd like to review some of the standard clauses or sections within 27701, as well as a few more specific areas of controls. So we'll go over that now. So there are 10 sections, I would call them, in the 701 standard. The first 3 are introductory in nature, very much like 27001. They're not the most interesting, so we're going to skip over those. However, sections 5 through 10 are sort of the interesting ones that I want to talk about. So section 4 is the context of your organization. As I mentioned earlier, it identifies the needs of the organization to protect and keep data private. So by identifying these things, you can establish your context and understand what controls need to be implemented. So section 5 is your leadership and commitment. So corporate or buy-in from the top is always important when it comes to security throughout an organization. It always takes the leaders being responsible, and that trickles down. It's very, very key important. And in 27701, that's equally as important here. So this underscores the importance of leadership for promoting and maintaining that PIMS, or that privacy information management systems. Some of the key points to look at here are the leadership responsibilities. So who in leadership is responsible for tracking and keeping these privacy policies and these information security policies up to date and making sure they're effective. Accountability and authority. So this defines the roles and responsibility of privacy management, as well as designating specific privacy officers or personnel with the authority over PIMS and its implementation. And this also includes resource and competence to make sure that your organization is allocating its resources properly and ensure that the staff it has employed in these important roles are competent and well aware of the privacy-related responsibilities and regulations. Moving on to section 6, planning is a huge part of this. Again, these are all going to be similar to 7001, but they do have specifics that we need to mention. So section 6 outlines planning aspects of the of managing privacy and information within the organization. This includes looking at your actions to address risks and opportunities. So this so essentially how you're going to manage your risks, how you're identifying them, and what you're going to do to fix those risks. And privacy objectives and planning to achieve them. So it's about developing plans to achieve your goals with information risk management and privacy management. And this includes specifying how compliance and other legal requirements are going to need to be addressed and are going to have to be supported within your organization. Speaking of which, we have Section 7, which is support. So the real emphasis on this clause is to understand the support that's needed to establish and maintain your PIMs effectively. This includes ensuring that you have resources available. So you're going to need the necessary resources to support your PIMs or your ISMS, as it were in 27001. Competence, making sure you have, again, have the knowledge on staff and the competence to be handling these things correctly. Awareness is a very, very important one that not a lot of companies focus enough, in my personal opinion. It's making sure that all of your staff, regardless of their role or leadership or where they are aware and understands their part of the puzzle when it comes to protecting and keeping personal data private. Communication is very, very key. So we establish communication standards as well as rules for processing and communicating data internally as well as with external stakeholders regarding privacy issues, and documentation, as we mentioned, is a big part of that. Section 8, moving on, is operation. So this details the more operational aspects, or how we actually plan on setting about and going and handling these risks and keeping our information private. So there's a number of key points or controls within the operation. These include operational planning and controlling. So this means the organization is responsible for establishing and implementing operational processes specific to achieving privacy objectives, which are defined in your PIMs. We have data processing activities. So I mentioned earlier with DPIAs, it's responsibility of this organization to manage its data processing activities. And we do this by items or actions such as risk assessments, data protection impact assessments, and tracking those things through either an IRC or through the appropriate roles for implementation of the appropriate security measures. Incident response and monitoring. This is very similar to 27001, but obviously we're including privacy to make sure that our PIMs or PIMs documentation remains effective, and as well as audit and review. So conducting audits either annually, sometimes biannually, or as it's defined in your PIMs. And these are used to assess the continuing suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of our PIMs and information security. So these, Section 9 is performance evaluation. So obviously as we put our operation standards into place, we need to make sure that the performance or the actual administration of these tasks is appropriate and effective within the organization. So by setting objectives to how you monitor your performance, you can make sure that during your regular audits and your reviews, in all your evaluations, that the PIMs or your controls continue to be effective and they continue to be robust enough that they can continue on, rather than just being able to prove one time that you're able to do something when it's not something that's sustainable to the business. So performance evaluation makes sure that is a sustainable, those are sustainable actions that you can continue to do as you continue to grow. In Section 10, and if probably one of the most important, if not the most important section, is improvement. And this is something that's been echoed for 27001 many times as well. Something we always talk to our clients about, that these standards are all about continuing to improve. It's always a lot of hard work. It's very rewarding work, but hard work to get a lot of these policies and procedures and documentation in place to make sure we're hitting these really high and strict standards, because the things we protect and the things our business controls are very important. It's important to realize that it's not just information on a spreadsheet. A lot of times, we're talking about the people we're protecting, not necessarily just this data. So by focusing on improvement rather than some sort of point in time check the box standard, we're going to continue to address nonconformities. We're going to continue to take corrective actions and always implementing new preventative measures. We get this feedback from all of our audits or reviews, risk assessments and things like that. we're always making sure that even if we meet a high standard today, when you're always continuing to get a little bit better, continue to move that bar higher and higher, not just for our business, but for our partners and vendors. So those are the sections 4 through 10 that are really important pillars of the standard. A lot of what people think about when it comes to the standard, or a lot of when people think about requirements, what they're really talking about are the annex controls. So in 27001, you have a number of annex controls that are essentially actual set and fixed, objectives or things you need to do, things you'll be able to prove. 27701 is no different. So we do have Annex A and Annex B controls, and these are the actual specific controls that are mentioned to the standard that are applicable to PII controllers and PII processors respectively. So these, like 27001, are the prescriptive controls meant to be presented to an auditor in order to obtain certification. So I mentioned controller and processor a couple times. So let's kind of talk about what that means in the context of what we're doing. So a data controller for an organization is for an organization that determines the purpose for which and the means by which personal data is processed. So that means that this person is the one who essentially owns or controls. They are the person in charge of that data. This is my data and I handle it. They would be considered a data controller. A data processor, on the other hand, is an organization that processes personal data on the behalf of a data controller. So a data controller is responsible for ensuring that the processing of personal data is carried out with accordance to 701 if they're a certified organization. The data processor is the one that needs to follow the instructions of the data controller in order to make sure and implement appropriate technical and organizational measures that personal data stays protected. So a couple examples of a controller versus a processor might look something like this. So think of a social media company. They would be a data controller for the personal data of its users. Facebook, X, Threads. They would be considered data controllers because they are the ones that are holding, storing, maintaining, and otherwise in possession of that data. Another sort of moving on from there, a data processor, a great example would be something like a cloud computing provider. In that case, you would be a data processor. You are not controlling or owning any of that data that your users are sending through your platform. You are simply using your services to process that data. So your responsibilities for keeping that data private are going to be very, very different. A payroll company, for example, is another great example of a data processor, where the personal data of its customers and their employees are simply processed on their behalf. They do not control that data. So moving on, now that we kind of understand what a controller versus a processor is, let's look at those annex controls again, or start to look at those annex controls. So we have Annex A and Annex B, which outlines the controls for these. Annex A are the set of controls for PII controllers. So these are designed to protect the privacy of PII that they collect and process. So there's a wide range of things that these annex controls review. These include the conditions for collecting and processing PII, pardon me. So this includes things like consent management, purpose of that data, their purpose of collection. So that's something that these annex controls address. We won't have time to go over all of these individual controls, obviously. So we're looking through the categories and sort of the topics that these controls cover. Obligations to PII principles is, I think, one of the biggest ones in this as well. So it's about understanding your regulatory requirements and obligations to that PII as a controller that you have in order to keep that information safe and private. So privacy by design and privacy by default is another pillar of this as well. And that ensures that at every step throughout the process that PII is collected and held, that there's privacy in mind every step along the way. This could be encryption at rest, all the way to encryption at transfer, making sure that you understand regulatory compliance during a process or during a transfer. So if you're transferring data from the EU to the United States or vice versa, you need to understand, obviously, the obligations met by those requirements that we mentioned as well, but that all these transfers are done in a way that is designed to be private by default and doesn't require any extra additional action. Data security, even though this is more of a 27001 focus, obviously 701 is built upon that. So data security is a big part of it. Data access controls. So this builds upon what 27001 already does with access controls and takes it a step further in understanding not only who has access to it, but how that access or what that access potentially means to that data. So how it's designed to be used while it's accessed. Data retention and disposal, understanding how long or what rights you have to keep and retain that data. Data breach and response is a big one as well, especially now, as time goes on with more data breaches and more incidents making it in the news. Understanding your role when it comes to privacy in a data breach and response perspective, this builds again on 27001, understanding those legal obligations to an individual privacy as well as incident management, as we mentioned. So those are really the concepts that Annex A is designed to bring to the forefront or designed to control for PII controllers. Moving on to Annex B, these are going to be controls for PII processors. Again, processors are those who process PII or information on behalf of their customers. So a lot of these can be similar to the controls in Annex A, but they are more tailored for the specific needs of a processor. The regulatory burden of a processor, generally speaking, is quite a bit less than that of a controller. Obviously, security and privacy needs to be a major pillar of the infrastructure. So you still have to understand privacy by design and privacy by default, but there's a far more focus on contracts and management and defining those responsibilities as a processor than there is a controller, where you're really concerned about the constant vigilance and state of that data that you control. That is your responsibility essentially at all times, whether it's being processed or not. So some of the key controls in Annex B are, as I mentioned, contracts. So contracts with your customers is defining exactly what rights or roles you have with that PII, how it's designed to be used. This is a very, very explicit thing that's always defined within these contracts and is a big part of any processor's role in 701. Data security and access control, as well as retention disposal. Again, very similar to Annex A, but these are now all going to be slightly modified with the understanding that this isn't data that you actually own yourself. You're essentially acting as a processor or as a service to one of your customers. So processors are also required to do a lot of additional controls that aren't necessarily part of Annex A, but focus a lot more on applicable data privacy laws and regulations. And these also still do include data retention and disposal, data breach response, as well as incident management. So just because you are not the owner or controller of that data does not make you not responsible for that data while it's being processed. Privacy by design and privacy by default are still required as a processor, for example, as a cloud provider, to ensure that your customers have a sense of safety and security with the data they are entrusting you to, trusting you to process. So that is a quick overview of our Annex A and Annex B controls. So we've defined a controller and a processor and how it works. So kind of wrapping up here, who is 27701 for? Again, we looked at some really great examples, cloud providers, maybe software providers who, software as a service providers. So these are people like payment processors, cloud providers, things where the data that's being sent is not their data. You're looking at, you need to find a way to ensure that your customers and your partners can trust that you're using their data properly and that it's being properly protected against intrusion and kept privately. This could also include things, for example, as a as a controller. Again, social media companies was a great example we looked at. Facebook, Twitter, Threads. All these people are responsible for controlling that data. So you as a user are submitting your data to that platform to control. So essentially, if individual data is something that your company handles in any way, be it processing, controlling, 27701 should be something that you look to implement. So you need to look beyond just security and look more toward the privacy and the individuals, understanding laws and regulations. Just like 7000 or 27001 was designed to do, there is a lot to be gained from certification, whether it just be, whether that be things like, there is a lot to be gained with certification, whether that be just reputational gain, whether it be improving your vendor onboarding process or vendor management process. It could even just be finding or giving yourself the leg up when it comes to big clients. Growing companies often are always trying to find a way to break into bigger and newer markets, finding bigger partners, working with those big billion-dollar S&P 500 companies. Things like this help you stand out against the crowd, who otherwise these big companies are just maybe have to trust implicitly or have to go through these long process. 27701 certification is a fantastic way to get your names at the top of the list. All right. Well, that is, I think, about all the time we're going to have for this overview. I think we've hit pretty much everything we needed to. We talked about 27001 in review. We talked about 701 and how it adds to the security of 27001. We talked about some of its key pillars, what it's designed to do, how it's designed to do it, some of the documentation and controls, as well as definitions within 27701 to kind of help you understand who this is for, why it's there, and why you would need it. I will go ahead and take a couple minutes and ask for any questions that anyone might have. I'd be happy to answer. Okay, so this hasn't been asked in the chat yet, but one thing I think, or one question I originally had when I was first learning some of these things, you actually can certify for 27701 without being a 27001 certified company already. So if you really wanted to, you actually could certify all at once. As I mentioned before, 701 is designed to be an addition to 27001, but there really isn't anything saying you can go straight to 27701 certified and do it all together. However, 701 is not available as a certification separately. So you cannot be 27701 certified without also being 27001 certified, since they are 701 is built upon 27001 as an addition. All right, and I think we're all set then. I don't see any additional questions coming in. Well, thank you all very much for joining. It was really great to sit and talk to you and really kind of help put a little more information out there on 27701, since it is such a fairly new standard. There isn't a lot of great resources, so we really wanted to be a part of this and put some of that out for everyone to have. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any other additional questions, or perhaps there's something I didn't get to talk about. If you visit our website, cyberdatapros.com, you'll see a link to fill out a request for information, and we'd love to set up a meeting and talk to you about 27701, maybe if it's right for you, or maybe even additional services. We do all sorts of different compliance consulting, yeah. Thank you all very much for being here. We'll talk to you soon. See you next webinar Wednesday. Take care.